We now return to our interview with Robert Wuthnow, the Andlinger Professor of Sociology at Princeton University.
So that's why I say overall, both in terms of the reality of their social ties and in terms of the kind of mythology that they were picking up and that was being told about them, they were very much affirming the kind of basic story of America that we've had in the past.
That's very interesting. And let's talk, sort of this was one outside culture entering another and sort of some conflicts as they merge. Let's talk a little bit about two aspects of American culture, and I think one that's pretty timely considering just how much has been sort of discussed about religion after the 2004 election. Is it fair to really lump religious voters into a group, and sort of how much do you see that as a almost like class or division of America, the religious sort of value-minded citizen who then goes to the polls?
We're kind of getting at the culture wars question, I think, or the values voters question, or the religious right versus other groups. Yeah, it's an interesting question, especially, as you say, after the 2004 election. In this book, we looked at that to some extent. I wrote a chapter about it, and then it's come up in some of the other things I've been working on. One of the things that intrigued me, which I think I'd have to say, yes, does give some credence to that way of dividing up the society politically, is that a lot of the people we interviewed, both among new immigrants and among other kind of native-born Americans, said, well, when we think about religion, we may be Christian, of course, the majority religion in the United States, or we may be Jewish or Muslim or something else, but we kind of think that all religions are true. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because that kind of fits with a sense of tolerance, and everybody is equal in that respect. We're not going to discriminate on the basis of religion. As many as 2/3 of the public would tell us that. We did a survey as well where that came out. And so I tried to interview people about, what that exactly meant, whether it meant that they were also just very tolerant in politics. Well, it was the case that people who were more tolerant about religions kind of being the same and interchangeable were also more tolerant on political issues and tended to be on the left of the spectrum more than the right. And I thought, well, if that's the case, why is it that the religious right seems to have as much influence as it does? Even though by that way of thinking about it, it's a minority group. Well, one reason is that the religious right includes people who really have strong convictions that they, in fact, are right. And so that gives a certain amount of power. If one person comes along and says, you believe what you want, I'll believe what I want, your opinion, my opinion, who cares, they're all the same, and somebody else comes along and says, this is God's truth, you got to believe it or else, well, who has more power? Now, that, of course, is not at all to say that that's why a certain group actually has political power. It's not to say anything, for instance, about why the Bush administration does what it does, or why we invaded Iraq, or anything like that. But it does help, I think, to explain why a small portion of the population, whether it's 20% or whether it's 10%, sometimes gets so motivated because of their religious beliefs that they really do go out and have a much stronger influence than they would otherwise.
Okay, but then let's say let's talk maybe a little bit about the fact that in many ways, economically speaking, a lot of the policies that they would go vote for are counter to their interests, but they will say, well, and I mean, polling will indicate, I don't know how accurate that polling is, but it will indicate that people would say go and vote on a set of issues like abortion and more religiously associated issues, but end up actually electing people who would not represent necessarily their economic interests. What kind of contrast does that present? Because really, that's been a major question for liberals and for the Democratic Party too. Is completely not understanding what's going on when people will vote against ostensibly their interests.
Yeah, this is the argument that, of course, has appeared in many places, but a few years ago was probably articulated most clearly by Thomas Frank in his book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And his argument was basically not only in Kansas, but kind of using Kansas as an example, precisely what you just said, that, here there seem to be people who are voting against their economic best interests because they are being told by preachers or other leaders that these so-called values issues having to do with abortion or homosexuality or whatever it might be are so much more important. And so Thomas Frank's question was, why is that possible? Well, I happen to be from Kansas, and so I've thought about it a lot in that context. And I haven't done any research out there, so I don't really know for sure. But here's my speculation, and it came to me largely from seeing a very powerful film on PBS that I would recommend. It can be found on the internet or bought on the internet. It's called Zenith. And it was produced by a prize-winning producer from the BBC who happened to have some connections in a little town in Kansas called Zenith. And so you hear these people talking in great detail and very candidly about their lives. And the economic issues are clear. You have people sitting around in this community saying they're getting the same price for wheat that they did back during the Great Depression, let's say, or you see men who are earning basically minimum wage driving trucks or something like that. And you also have a very sad, moving scene in the movie where this woman is standing in her front door looking out, and there's this horrific hailstorm that's just wiping out all the crops, and she knows they're not going to have any income. And so you'd say, well, these people ought to be, voting for somebody who's going to help them economically. But what happens, and this is not a community of fundamentalists by any means, but they're a fairly religious kind of Midwestern community. And so what you see as people talk about their religion is that their world is very much, quite literally, a black and white world, a world between good choices and bad choices. And the way that comes up is precisely on moral issues, where the men sitting around the gas station talk about, how they used to get drunk every Saturday night, come home, beat their wife, and now they go to church. And others, and some of the women, tell the same kind of stories, that their kids were on drugs or still are on drugs, but there are good people in town. So it's kind of like there are good people in town and there are bad people in town. And it really does come down to moral issues. And so you can kind of see, well, okay, that's why some of these moral issues are important, even if it's something that may not affect their community that directly, such as abortion maybe or homosexuality. But they see the world in moral terms. They're good people or they're bad people.